Harold Matthews had been coming to Murphy's auto shop every month for the past 6 months, always with the same polite smile and the same apologetic tone when he couldn't afford the extra repairs they kept finding. At 74, with arthritis making it difficult to work on his truck himself, he trusted the mechanics to be honest about what needed fixing. Today's visit started like all the others, until the invoice showed $1,200 for a transmission fluid change that should have cost. Harold's hands shook as he reached for his disability check, not from his old war injury but from the realization that his trust had been turned into profit. He had no idea that his grandson Marcus, recently returned from deployment, had been quietly watching this happen for months. And Marcus wasn't coming alone. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gravel lot of Murphy's auto shop as Harold Matthews pulled up in his aging Ford pickup truck. The engine made that familiar rattling sound that had been getting worse each week, the same sound that had brought him here 6 times in the past half-year. Harold turned off the ignition and sat for a moment, gathering the strength to face another repair bill he probably couldn't afford. At 74 years old, Harold moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had endured more than its share of hardship. His left leg, stiffened by shrapnel from Vietnam, required a walking cane that he'd grown to accept as part of his daily routine. The arthritis in his hands made gripping tools difficult, which meant the simple maintenance he'd once performed on his vehicles was now beyond his capabilities. Independence had been everything to Harold, but age and injury had a way of reshaping a man's relationship with pride. Murphy's auto shop sat on the outskirts of Millfield, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The shop had been there for nearly 15 years, serving the local community with what most people assumed was honest, reliable service. The building itself was unremarkable. Concrete block structure with 3 bay doors and an office that smelled perpetually of motor oil and burnt coffee. Harold pushed open the glass door, the familiar chime announcing his arrival. Behind the counter stood Tommy Murphy, the shop's owner and head mechanic. Tommy was in his early 40s, with grease-stained hands and the kind of confidence that came from running the only auto repair business within 20 miles. When he saw Harold approaching, his expression shifted into what could generously be called a smile. "Well, if it isn't our favorite customer," Tommy said, his tone carrying a note that Harold chose to interpret as friendly. "Let me guess, that old truck of yours is giving you trouble again." Harold nodded, leaning slightly on his cane. "The rattling's gotten worse, and it seems to be losing power when I go up hills. I was hoping you could take a look." Tommy exchanged a glance with his assistant, Jake, a younger man who had learned to follow his boss's lead in all matters. "Sure thing, Harold. We'll get her up on the lift and see what's going on. You know we always take good care of you." What Harold didn't see was the subtle smirk that passed between Tommy and Jake, or the way Tommy's fingers drummed against the counter as he calculated opportunity. Harold represented everything Tommy had come to expect from certain customers: elderly, trusting, and lacking the mechanical knowledge to question professional diagnosis. As the mechanics began their inspection, Harold settled into the waiting area's worn plastic chairs. The magazine selection was limited to automotive publications from several years past, but Harold wasn't really reading. Instead, he was mentally calculating his monthly budget, trying to figure out how much he could afford to spend on repairs without cutting into his grocery money or his prescription costs. Harold's financial situation was what economists might politely call fixed income, but what Harold experienced is a constant juggling act. His disability compensation from the VA covered his basic needs, but there wasn't much room for unexpected expenses. Each visit to Murphy's shop had cost more than the last, with Tommy always finding additional problems that needed immediate attention. After an hour of inspection, Tommy emerged from beneath the truck, wiping his hands on a rag with theatrical slowness. His expression was serious, the kind that suggested bad news was coming. "Harold, I've got to level with you," Tommy began, his voice taking on a tone of practiced concern. "This is worse than I thought. Your transmission is on its last legs. The fluid's completely contaminated, the filter's shot, and there's metal shavings throughout the system. We're looking at a complete transmission service. Plus I found some issues with your brake lines that are definitely safety concerns." Harold felt his stomach drop. How much are we talking about? Tommy consulted his clipboard with the deliberate pace of someone building suspense. Well, the transmission service alone is going to run about 800. The brake line replacement is another 300. And I noticed your serpentine belt is frayed. That's another 150. We're looking at 1250 total. The number hit Harold like a physical blow. $1,250 represented nearly 2 months of his disability income. His hands began to shake slightly, a combination of his medication side effects and the stress of the situation. That seems like quite a bit, Harold said quietly, his voice carrying the uncertainty of someone who wanted to question the diagnosis but lacked the knowledge to do so effectively. Tommy's expression shifted to one of patient condescension. Harold, I understand it's a lot of money, but these aren't optional repairs. Your transmission could fail completely if we don't service it, and those brake lines are a safety issue. I'd hate to see you stranded on the side of the road. Or worse. The mention of safety concerns effectively ended any debate Harold might have mounted. At his age, the prospect of being stranded or losing control of his vehicle was genuinely frightening. He nodded slowly, accepting the inevitable. I suppose I don't have much choice, Harold said, reaching for his checkbook with hands that trembled slightly. When can you have it finished? We can get started right away, Tommy replied, his tone becoming more businesslike now that the sale was secure. Should have you back on the road by tomorrow afternoon. What Harold didn't know was that his monthly visits to Murphy's auto shop had become a case study in predatory pricing. Each repair had been legitimate in the technical sense. Work had been performed, parts had been replaced, but the costs had been inflated far beyond fair market value. Tommy had identified Harold as what he privately called a golden goose, a customer who paid without questioning and returned regularly. The transmission service that Tommy had quoted at $800 could have been completed for less than $200. The brake line replacement he'd priced at $300 was a 15-minute job that required $30 in parts. The serpentine belt that supposedly needed immediate replacement had been changed just 3 months earlier during Harold's previous visit. As Harold wrote out the check, his hand shaking from both medication and stress, he tried to maintain the dignity that had carried him through 7 decades of life. He'd learned long ago that complaining rarely improved difficult situations, and at his age, he had little energy for confrontation. Thank you for taking care of this, Harold said, handing over the check. I know you'll do good work. Tommy accepted the payment with what he considered professional courtesy. Always do right by our customers, Harold. That's what keeps people coming back. Harold left the shop that afternoon with a lighter wallet and a heavier heart. The financial strain of constant repairs was beginning to affect his quality of life in ways he hadn't shared with anyone. Meals had become simpler and less frequent. Prescription medications were occasionally stretched longer than recommended. The small luxuries that made retirement bearable, a newspaper subscription, the occasional restaurant meal, Christmas gifts for his grandchildren, had been systematically eliminated from his budget. What Harold also didn't know was that his financial difficulties hadn't gone unnoticed by his family. Marcus Williams, Harold's grandson, had recently returned from his second deployment overseas. At 28 years old, Marcus was a staff sergeant in the Army's 82nd Airborne Division, a man who had learned to pay attention to details and protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Marcus had been quietly concerned about his grandfather's increasing financial stress for months. During his recent visits home, he'd noticed Harold's refrigerator becoming more sparse, his medications running lower than they should, and his generally declining spirits. When Harold mentioned that his truck repairs were becoming more frequent and expensive, Marcus's military-trained instincts had begun to raise questions. 3 weeks earlier, Marcus had taken leave to spend time with his grandfather, and had accompanied Harold to Murphy's auto shop for what Tommy had described as a routine brake inspection. Marcus, who had learned basic automotive maintenance during his military service, had quietly observed the interaction with growing suspicion. The brake inspection that Tommy had performed in Marcus's presence had revealed several urgent issues that required immediate attention. Marcus had watched as Tommy pointed out supposedly worn brake pads, damaged rotors, and a brake fluid leak that demanded immediate repair. The total cost had been quoted at $450. What had triggered Marcus's suspicion was his own inspection of the vehicle after leaving the shop. Using knowledge gained from maintaining military vehicles, Marcus had examined the brake system himself and found no evidence of the problems Tommy had identified. The brake pads were worn but well within acceptable limits. The rotors showed normal wear patterns. There was no brake fluid leak. Marcus had said nothing to his grandfather at the time, not wanting to undermine Harold's trust in people he'd been dealing with for months. But Marcus had also not forgotten. Military training had taught him that patterns of behavior revealed true intentions, and Tommy Murphy's pattern was becoming clear. Over the following weeks, Marcus had quietly investigated Murphy's auto shop's reputation within the local veteran community. What he discovered had confirmed his worst suspicions. Harold wasn't the only elderly veteran who had been systematically overcharged for unnecessary or inflated repairs. Murphy's shop had developed an unofficial specialty in targeting customers who were unlikely to seek second opinions or challenge professional diagnoses. The investigation had also revealed something else. Marcus wasn't the only military family member who had noticed the pattern. Several other soldiers, sailors, and Marines had begun comparing notes about their relatives' experiences with Murphy's shop. What had started as Marcus's personal concern had evolved into something large, which brought the situation to this particular morning, when Harold had once again driven to Murphy's shop for repairs, unaware that his grandson was finally ready to act. Marcus had spent the previous evening coordinating with 9 other military personnel, all of whom had family members who had been victimized by Murphy's predatory practices. The group included soldiers from Harold's grandson's unit, Marines from a nearby base, and Navy personnel who had heard about the situation through military networks. Their plan was simple, direct, and designed to send a message that would be impossible to ignore. As Harold sat in Murphy's waiting area, watching Tommy complete the transmission service that would cost him his grocery money for the next month, Marcus was organizing a response that would fundamentally change how Murphy's auto shop conducted business. At exactly 2:30 p.m., as Tommy was presenting Harold with the completed work and the devastating bill, the shop's front door chimed to announce new customers. Tommy looked up to see a man in military dress uniform walking through the entrance. Then another. Within 60 seconds, 10 active-duty military personnel had entered Murphy's auto shop. They wore the uniforms of different branches: Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, but their expressions were uniformly serious. They moved with the coordinated precision of people accustomed to working as a unit, and their presence immediately transformed the atmosphere of the small shop. Tommy Murphy felt his mouth go dry as he realized that his small auto repair shop had suddenly become the focus of a military operation. Marcus Williams, now in his Army dress uniform with sergeant stripes clearly visible, stepped forward and addressed his grandfather directly. "Grandpa Harold, how much did they charge you today?" Harold looked confused by the sudden appearance of his grandson and the 9 other military personnel. "Marcus, what are you doing here? The bill is $1,250. But $1,250? Marcus repeated, his voice carrying across the shop with military authority. He turned to face Tommy Murphy directly. For what exactly? Tommy's confident demeanor had evaporated completely. He stammered as he tried to explain the work that had been performed, but his usual sales pitch sounded hollow and unconvincing when delivered to an audience of trained military personnel. Transmission service, brake line replacement, serpentine belt. Tommy managed to say all necessary work, completely legitimate. Marcus nodded slowly, then gestured to one of the other soldiers. "Specialist Rodriguez here is a certified automotive technician. Mind if he takes a look at the work you performed?" It wasn't really a question. Rodriguez, a compact man with the bearing of someone accustomed to precision work, approached Harold's truck and began a thorough inspection. The other military personnel spread out through the shop, their presence making it impossible for Tommy or Jake to move without being observed. While Specialist Rodriguez conducts his inspection, Marcus continued, "Let me tell you what we've discovered about your business practices." Marcus began reciting a detailed account of Murphy's systematic overcharging of elderly veterans and their families. He provided specific examples, dates, and dollar amounts that demonstrated a clear pattern of predatory behavior. With each revelation, Tommy's face grew paler. My grandfather has paid you over $4,000 in the past 6 months, Marcus stated, for repairs that should have cost less than $800. You've been systematically targeting elderly veterans because you assumed they wouldn't question your diagnoses or seek second opinions. Rodriguez completed his inspection and returned to the group. Sergeant Williams, he reported formally, the transmission fluid appears to be clean and at proper levels. The brake lines show no signs of recent replacement. The serpentine belt appears to be in good condition and shows no indication of recent installation. The implication was clear. Virtually none of the work that Tommy had charged for had actually been performed. Tommy tried to defend himself, claiming that the work had been completed according to professional standards, but his explanations became increasingly desperate and contradictory. The presence of trained automotive technicians among the military personnel made it impossible for him to maintain his deception. Marcus allowed Tommy's explanations to continue for several minutes, letting the man incriminate himself further with each word. Then he raised his hand for silence. Here's what's going to happen, Marcus announced. You're going to refund every penny you've overcharged my grandfather and the other veterans whose families are represented here today. You're going to provide written documentation of all work performed on their vehicles, and you're going to close this shop until you can guarantee that you'll conduct business honestly. Tommy began to protest, claiming that he couldn't afford to make such large refunds, that his business would be ruined, that the accusations were unfair. His protests were cut short when one of the Marines, a gunnery sergeant with 20 years of service, stepped forward. "Sir," the Marine said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had seen combat, "you've been stealing from people who served their country, people who sacrificed their health and their youth to protect the freedoms you've been exploiting. This isn't a negotiation." The weight of the situation finally seemed to penetrate Tommy's consciousness. He was facing 10 military personnel who had documented evidence of his fraudulent practices. His attempts to defend himself had only made his situation worse, and word of this confrontation would inevitably spread throughout the local community. Tommy looked around the shop that had been his livelihood for 15 years, realizing that his predatory business practices had finally caught up with him. The easy money he'd made from targeting vulnerable customers now seemed catastrophically expensive. "How much?" Tommy asked quietly. "Are we talking about in total refunds?" Marcus consulted a notebook where he'd documented each veteran's overcharges, counting my grandfather and the 8 other families represented here, approximately $15,000. The number hit Tommy like a physical blow. $15,000 represented months of profit, money that he'd already spent on upgrading his shop equipment and his personal lifestyle. But looking at the faces of the military personnel surrounding him, Tommy realized he had no realistic alternative. Over the next hour, Tommy Murphy processed refunds for Harold and the other victimized veterans. Each transaction was witnessed by multiple military personnel and documented with receipts and written acknowledgments. The shop's cash reserves were depleted, and Tommy was forced to write personal checks for the remaining amounts. Harold Matthews received a refund of $3,200, representing the amount he'd been overcharged during his 6 visits to Murphy's shop. As he held the check, his hands no longer shook from stress, but from the overwhelming realization that his financial burdens had been lifted. "Grandpa," Marcus said gently, "you don't have to worry about being taken advantage of anymore. We've got your back." Harold looked at his grandson with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. At 74 years old, he'd grown accustomed to fighting his battles alone, accepting that vulnerability was simply part of aging. The idea that someone was watching out for him, protecting him, was almost overwhelming. As the military personnel prepared to leave Murphy's auto shop, they left behind more than just empty cash registers and depleted checking accounts. They left a message that would resonate throughout the local business community. Veterans and their families were not to be exploited. Word of the confrontation at Murphy's auto shop spread quickly through Millfield and the surrounding communities. Other businesses that had been engaging in similar predatory practices quietly reviewed their policies and pricing structure. The local newspaper ran a story about the incident, highlighting both the problem of elder financial abuse and the community response to protecting veterans. Tommy Murphy was forced to close his shop temporarily, while he sought financing to cover the refunds and legal costs. When he eventually reopened, his business practices had fundamentally changed. He could no longer afford to target vulnerable customers, both financially and reputationally. For Harold Matthews, the impact of that day extended far beyond the financial relief. His grandson's intervention had reminded him that he wasn't alone, that his family was watching out for him, and that his service to his country had earned him protectors who would stand up when he couldn't stand up for himself. Marcus Williams had learned something important as well. Military training had prepared him to protect his country and his fellow soldiers, but that day had taught him that the mission extended to protecting family and community members who couldn't protect themselves. 6 months later, Harold's truck was running better than it had in years. Marcus had arranged for honest, affordable maintenance through a shop owned by another veteran who understood the importance of fair dealing. Harold's monthly budget had stabilized, allowing him to afford proper nutrition and medications without stress. But perhaps more importantly, Harold had regained something he'd been losing gradually over the past few years, a sense that he mattered, that his dignity was worth protecting, and that the sacrifices he'd made during his military service had earned him a place in a community that would look out for him. The incident at Murphy's auto shop had demonstrated something that both Harold and Marcus would remember for the rest of their lives. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on foreign soil, but in small towns where trust is betrayed and dignity is under attack. And sometimes the most meaningful victories aren't measured in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in the simple act of ensuring that those who served their country are treated with the respect they've earned. As Harold often told Marcus in the months that followed, you don't have to wear a uniform to serve your community. Sometimes you just have to be willing to stand up when someone needs you to stand with them. And Marcus had learned that the values instilled by military service, loyalty, duty, honor, meant nothing if they weren't applied to protecting the people who mattered most. The lesson he'd learned in Murphy's auto shop would guide his actions for the rest of his life. Those who serve their country deserve more than gratitude. They deserve protection, dignity, and the assurance that their sacrifices will never be exploited by those who see vulnerability as opportunity. In the end, the story of Harold Matthews and Murphy's auto shop became more than just an account of consumer fraud and family loyalty. It became a reminder that respect isn't something that should be earned repeatedly, but something that should be protected by those with the power and responsibility to ensure that service and sacrifice are never taken advantage of by those who would profit from trust and vulnerability.